Uh, sciatic nerve.
Okay. Well, I learned something new.
Yeah. Great question.
That was interesting.
Hey, Julie. Hey, Diane. Welcome. Hey, how are you, Alex? Come on in. It's a bit warmer here by the devices. Sorry,
it's real cold when I came out of the bathroom.
Yeah, the hallway is exceptionally cold. I think we'll be okay here. If you want to bring this closer to you, you can route it there, but I think you'll be all right. All right, I'm going to go ahead and let Terry in, and then we can get started. Welcome, Josh, Kate, Jennifer, Terry. Good to see everyone. We're going to get started, and we're going to learn another Passover song. There are lots of Passover songs to learn if this is your first Passover. Ezra, if you could pull up Avadim Hayinu for us on the to share that in the Siddur. This is a song that we sing early on in the Seder, saying we were slaves, but now we are free people. And Ezra is going to teach us the melody.
Yeah, so the melody goes Avadim Hayinu, Hayinu. Ata b'nei chorin, b'nei chorin. Avadim hayinu. Ata b'nei chorin. Avadim hayinu. Ata b'nei chorin.
So this time I'm going to ask us to sing together now that we know the melody. As Ezra leads us again, let's join in and sing.
Excuse me, accidentally changed what page I was on.
I had to mute myself.
Here we go. Avadim hayinu, hayinu. Ata b'nei chorin, b'nei chorin. Avadim hayinu. Ata b'nei chorin. Avadim hayinu. Ata b'nei chorin. Ata b'nei chorin.
Okay, we were slaves, but now we are free people. That is the kind of the marching order for Passover, which is coming up in just a couple of weeks, which is how are we experiencing oppression and bitterness and slavery today? We're going to dive into that in a few minutes about where we're locating that sense of oppression in the world today. But before we do, I want to just kind of check in with you guys a little bit. So in the chat, go ahead and put something that is new or good for yourselves. Here at TBS, it's just Alex and myself. It's a cold, snowy afternoon, so I wasn't expecting many people to brave it, but that's fine. So Alex, give me a sense of new or good. What's new or good for you?
Well, I've made the final decision to go back to school,
Wow,
try and get a degree,
where are you gonna go?
wherever will take me.
Where do you think you're gonna study?
History.
Great.
So I do teaching.
That's great. Good luck.
Thank
Ezra, I'm seeing a couple folks post their chats in. If you could walk us through the chats, that would be great.
Of course, we have someone saying that they had a beautiful experience at a meditation circle, which really tied back to this group's conversation on prayer last week. It was very meaningful for them to think of attention as being emotionally engaged and not just transactional. Someone saying that they got 4 new fish. Someone saying that they got their new hip is feeling better each day. Someone was invited to a Passover Seder. Someone celebrated their grandson's 5th birthday.
Great, excellent news. Okay. Welcome, Gene Rhodes. Good to see you. And we are now going to get in motion. We started last week with a conversation about Passover and the Seder. Today is kind of like conversation number 2 about Passover, mostly focusing on the day after Seder, but we'll still do some Seder topics. And what I want you to also be aware of is first a logistical conversation about Passover, Seder stuff, your choices, your options. So here at Temple Beth Shalom, the Saturday night of Seder, that's April 16th, we have a community Seder here. We're just about full up. We've got, I think, 38 of the 40 seats are set. So we're really closing down soon, probably the next couple of days. And you should also know that if you're still looking for some Seder hospitality, Friday night for Seder for Hillel at Kent State, we are having an open Seder there. And so if you would like to join us at Hillel, Ezra, if you could put the link that I dropped in the lesson plan into the chat, folks could look at that. And so that Seder is going to be at 5:30 on Friday, April 15th. A couple of the one-on-one folks have joined us at the Seder at Hillel. Let me talk about that Seder and how it's different than the TBS Seder. It is also a communal Seder. Usually there's going to be about 40 students there with some families, some adults, some community members. The students are going to lead a bunch of that. So the students are going to be kind of the facilitators of the Seder. Very fun to hear 20-year-olds lead a Passover Seder. So their voices will kind of lead us through most of that gathering on Friday night. The other thing that's notably different between what we do on Friday night at Hillel and what we do Saturday night at Temple Beth Shalom. Saturday night we have Robin and her guitar, and the singing is a little bit more musical because of that. Doesn't mean the students don't know how to sing, it just means they don't have a guitar that is joining us. We have one student who might bring a guitar, but we're not going to have Robin kind of leading us through the melodies. What you should also know about both of these events is hybrid stuff. The Friday night Seder will be in person only. So for folks who are courageous enough to be in person, it's really an in-person gathering. The Saturday night Seder will have a hybrid option for the first hour or so. So when we're in the book and going through the readings, we will set up the owl here. We'll actually experiment and do a second owl nearby. And we'll try and do at least the first hour together for folks who want to be part of a Zoom Seder. We've done the last 2 years, we've had Zoom Seders. It is different, but also very fun. So if you would prefer to have a Zoom option, that's available on the second night. The other thing I'll just put out there that is another option for folks on the second night is the second night on campus at Kent State, there's going to be a communal Seder on campus at the Student Center. So if folks are interested in joining with students in person on the second night, There is registration for both of those two available at the link that you'll see. Now, one thing to just warn you is students have an availability to have Passover meals throughout Passover. So the lunches and dinners for the next week are going to be available. That's not for the community. We don't ask you to sign up for lunches or dinners, but if you want to sign up for Seder, you're welcome to join for our Seders. At both of those communal Seders at Kent State, we have room for more folks. So if like 10 people from this group wanted to join us Friday night or Saturday night, it's doable. We have plenty of space. We do ask if you join the Kent State Hillel Seders to make a donation. The food is going to be delicious. The chef is going to be cooking that stuff up. But we would also like donations for the gathering. That way our students can have their Seder meal free, which is a big treat for them. Okay. Any questions about Seder logistics before we dive into other stuff? Just checking. Go ahead, Len.
Yeah, just that you've mentioned Seder, 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 and then Seder. So I'm confused. Could you list them in an email?
Sure. Yeah, the email that I'll put out later tomorrow will have all the different logistics out there with the dates and the links to RSVP and all that good stuff.
Also, one other suggestion, the last email you sent about J101, you didn't have the link for the web, for the Zoom. If you'd include that each time, it would really be helpful for me anyway.
Sure. You should also know the link never changes. The link's been the same since the first class. So if you go to an old email, you can use those as well.
Now, I understand I had to search though, because an update screwed up everything on where I could find stuff. Okay, thanks.
Sure. Jeannie, yeah.
I know that, there's like the cleaning and getting rid of all the kummetz, which is the yeasted things. Is there a day that you start not having, bread and all that? Is there a certain time that you start that?
Yeah, and we're going to talk about cleaning out our chametz and then checking the chametz and the timing for that. We'll probably get to that in about, looks like in about 15-20 minutes or so. So we will get that topic about spring cleaning, Passover stuff. Any other logistics about the Seder stuff before we dive into other Passover and holiday topics? Okay, then I'm just going to go into the next piece. We're going to take a little peek at an item that comes up in the Seder called B'chol Dor Vador. In every generation,
Excuse me, Erin had a question. She had her hand up a moment ago.
Oh, thank you, Len. Go ahead, Erin. What's the question?
Thanks, Len. Are you still doing that class on April 2nd? Like that's just like about Passover? Awesome.
So this next 5-minute segment will be a part of that, but primarily, thank you, this Saturday morning from 9:30 to 11, we're going to do like 90 minutes on the Passover Haggadah. And
Perfect.
we both on Zoom and in person. And it's going to be kind of like the idea of if you're going to lead your own Seder with your family and friends, how do you do that? And like, what do you kind of do to prepare for that? So it's really so thinking from that question, like, how do we support Erin in all the things that she might need to make sure her guests feel like their Seder is beautiful and wonderful and all that good stuff?
Thank you.
That's going to be the goal of this class. So the topic we're going to talk about for the next 10 minutes is an element of that class, which is as we're retelling the story of the Passover exodus from slavery, there's a specific text that says your Seder story is not complete until you have fulfilled the obligation. It says, "B'chol dor v'dor," in every generation, we are obligated to see ourselves as leaving Egypt. So before you can understand that, you need to see that the Hebrew word Egypt is more than just a nation. The Hebrew term Mitzrayim means the narrow places. So b'chol dor v'dor, in every generation, we are obligated to see ourselves leaving the narrownesses, the narrow straits, the places of confinement, the places of oppression, the places of harshness, of bitterness. And from this more maybe contemporary lens, we can imagine a lot of ways of thinking about the pandemic life as a form of Egypt, as a place of narrowness and bitterness. We can also think about life during war in the Ukraine as a source of bitterness and a source of oppression. So I do think that this year, our Passover question is really going to speak deeply to us about where are we locating this sense of confinement, constrainment, narrowness? How are we navigating this? So Ezra's going to set up breakout rooms, and we're going to take 5 minutes. And in the breakout rooms, as you're beginning to think about this, the reason I'm planting this seed today is you're going to then have about 2 weeks to see if this seed grows. Where are you going to be in 2 weeks with this idea? So we're going to begin to talk about where we think we are navigating this, and it could be in a variety of different places. And so Ezra will set us up, and in a few minutes, we'll go into our breakout room. Before we go, I just want to see if there's any questions about the idea that in every generation, we are obligated, each of us in this Zoom room are obligated to see ourselves as leaving Egypt, seeing ourselves as leaving the narrowness of an aspect of our lives. And so that's the question you're going to be navigating. And Ezra, I'm going to go ahead and open our rooms for us, and I'll see everybody in about 5 minutes. Okay. So where's your mind thinking about the narrowness of Egypt right now?
Well, I think everybody kind of, in some way or another, even if you want.
That really turned out great.
Okay, welcome back to the main room. I want to get a quick sense of the different breakout rooms. Ezra, did you happen to peek in on a room or two?
Yeah, I spent most of my time in one room, but I did get a chance to hear some ideas. We were talking about how the narrow place in the modern day Egypt is something that you're continually going through, and it's something that if you have the opportunity to assist assist someone else who is struggling, or to work on an issue, you should, and that all causes are intermingled. So just because you have found relative safely and are out of your individual Egypt does not mean that you can abandon the general struggle for greater rights or greater freedom.
I love that. Yeah, that's a really great point. I want to just kind of take a quick survey of folks and get a sense of where were they noticing a sense of constrictedness, oppression. How are they navigating that as they're thinking about Passover this year? So let me just hear from a couple of folks. What's your sense of where are you bumping up against Egypt this year? Len, go ahead.
Yeah, I mentioned it to the group. My sense of bumping up against Egypt is the political scene in Ohio. It's just getting so conservative that I'd like to escape to somewhere else, and I just don't know where. So I have a hard time finding the Red Sea.
Okay. Other thoughts, other senses of where are you noticing oppression or harshness or bitterness in the world?
Nobody is oppressed? Hard to believe. Go for it, Dave.
You're on mute, David.
I started running in 1973. I ran to 2009, and now I'm oppressed by my inability to run, to walk, and I have to use a walker. So every time I get up and I walk, I have to walk with a walker. So my physical limitations are oppressive to me.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so part of what we're navigating is, on a very specific spiritual basis of our own limitations. And many people, I think, by extension, have felt a sense of oppression during the pandemic, that the pandemic is certainly not gone, but it does seem to be somewhat better today than it was 3 months ago, and certainly better than it was a few months before that. And so I do think for some of us, there will be this renewed sense of hopefulness at springtime, that we are rededicating our lives to a spring that will bring in more wellness, more health, more goodness. And I do think that that's going to be a big part of the component for Passover this year. Let's get one or two others. Who else is noticing a sense of oppression and as they're thinking about Passover this year? Jeannie, go ahead. Jeannie?
I just thought of this since we had our breakout, but accepting life and people as they are, to me, is a broadening from the narrowness of my point of view and my history and my that just feels very constrained, and so that would be the thing that I struggle against, because when you accept life as it is, it's very really nice.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. I also want to point us to a very specific element of the Seder plate, which is we have both the traditional symbols on the Seder plate, meaning there's the parsley, symbol of spring, there's the egg, which is another symbol of spring, a sign of a new birth. And there's also the contemporary symbols that we've been adding in as liberal Jews in the last 40 or 50 years. So one of those new symbols that we have added in is a cup of water that sits alongside a cup of wine for Elijah, the prophet. This cup of water is called Miriam's cup. And we have been celebrating the voice of women and the role of women in our communities for the last 50 years. And so one of the things that we will be adding in here at TBS, at Temple B'Shalom, is the importance of women's voices in our communities, and certainly something that is going to be up for a number of women back at Hillel at Kent State will be reproductive rights, right? How are women's reproductive rights going to be completely upended after the last 40 years of freedom, or at least opportunity to have an expansion of liberties? That expansiveness is going to feel very constricted early in June when those laws are shifted and changed. And so I do think that is going to be a big topic at many Passover Seders this year, is how women's reproductive rights are going to be greatly inhibited quickly, and how this state of Ohio will follow in with the other right-wing states that will ban abortion procedures quickly. So how do we as liberal folks in liberal parts of Ohio still support our women in our communities as they are navigating a loss, a dramatic loss of reproductive rights. I think that's going to be a big piece of this. Hang on, Lynn, you already had a chance. So we're going to touch on a couple other symbols, but remember what you're thinking about. I'll come back to you in a minute. The other symbol that we've added into our Seder, our new symbol, is an orange on the Seder plate. And depending on where you come from, the orange is either a symbol for women's roles as rabbis in the community or as LGBTQ voices in the community. That it was also presented as a feminist, it was presented by Susanna Heschel as not only a feminist approach, but also a lesbian approach. And so that orange on the Seder plate is another contemporary symbol. And because of this opportunity to offer up other symbols on our Seder plate, the new question that some people have been asking me and others in the last week is, what should we do for Ukraine? And so one of the ideas about symbolizing Ukrainian oppression right now is to have sunflowers in a vase on your Passover table. That many of us will have beautiful flower arrangements at our Seder. And what would it look like to have some sunflowers there as a symbol of Ukrainian hopes for peace? And I think it's a really powerful piece that we can be very creative here, right? We can find ways to express our concerns and find a moment during the Seder where we can talk about women's rights or LGBTQ rights or our hopes, wishes, and dreams for Ukraine. Len, go ahead. I saw your hand earlier, and what was your thought about this?
Very quickly, I think there should be a third cup in addition to the wine and the water for a huge group that needs to have at least understanding and compassion, if not freedom. And that would be a cup for children, maybe juice.
Maybe, could be. Certainly an option. I think one of the ways to think about that is that we have two specific rituals specifically for kids in mind at the Seder. We ask the youngest kid who's at least able to read to ask the 4 questions. And then we celebrate the 4 children and their 4 different learning perspectives. And so I do think that one of the hopes for me as an educator at the Seder is that the children's voices are present. And so children's questions and children's perspective doesn't seem to be as lacking in representation as perhaps women or LGBTQ or Ukraine specifically. I think we can certainly celebrate children's voices and have a cup of juice. It's a lovely idea. I wouldn't say no to that. So thank you, Len. Cheryl, go ahead.
I remember years back, there started to be a 4th matzah at the plate for, at that time, Soviet Jews who weren't allowed to leave the Soviet Union. And my own personal thing is that I've kept the 4th matzah for people who are not free, and each year enumerate who they might be. So I was thinking of doing that for Ukraine this year, but I like the sunflowers.
It's a beautiful idea, Cheryl. And I think, for those of us that have celebrated Passover in the 80s and prior, when the Soviet Union was in power and Jews were desperately fighting to have any kind of Passover celebration that they might have because of the limitations of the former Soviet Union. I think the 4th matzah was an amazing symbol. And I think it's a beautiful idea that we should all be adding that piece in. It's really, I think, it's going to be challenging to kind of rewind our memories 30 years plus to what life was like for Jews in the former Soviet Union, and to think that that could be something similar today, that there's going to be a group of people that are navigating certainly a sense of limitations and struggle. And so I think it's a beautiful idea. Thank you. Okay. Any other thoughts about B'chol Dor Vador or celebrating this moment before we move on? Then I'm going to move on to our next part of this. And that's to talk about the day after the first and second Seder. So the first day or two of Passover is called Yom Tov, or festival time. And then the in-between days, the next day, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are called Chol HaMoed, the days of gathering. And Chol HaMoed has its own separate Passover celebrations for those of us that continue to celebrate Passover after the Seder. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. One of the things that we do during Passover, for those of us who go to morning services, is we sing a section of the Passover Haggadah called Hallel, upbeat, lovely dance songs. And so we're supposed to sing Hallel every morning for all 8 days of Passover. The other thing that is often studied during those 8 days is a special book in the Hebrew Bible called the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim. In the Christian Bible, this is also often called the Song of Solomon. And so this is a really beautiful series of love poems, and it becomes a way to deepen our experience that when we are really free, if we really are trying to celebrate our freedom and springtime, one of the things we can celebrate is our ability to fall in love at springtime. It's another trope of spring. And so this love poetry becomes part of the Passover experience. It is both looked at as perhaps wedding poetry of ancient Israel from 2,500 years ago, as well as a way to think about Israel's love for God. And so the traditional view of Song of Songs is to think about it as God's love for Israel and Israel's love for God. I like to think about it as beautiful love poetry that is about not just the male version of love, because most of the Hebrew Bible is only from a male-dominant lens, but here half of the poems clearly are from the female perspective and looking at the woman's idea of how she, in that heteronormative way, is looking to acquire a male partner. So one thing we did with Ezra and a few others a couple of weeks ago is we read some verses of Song of Songs. And for those of us that were attracted to male partners, we read those verses, and those attracted to female partners, we read those verses. And those of us that are attracted to both read both sets of verses. So to really, complicate and really, I think, make it meaningful was really a beautiful part of that. I also want to look at a couple other parts of the practices that develop after Seder. One is that we begin counting the Omer on the second night of Passover. And we're going to dive into what this count is about in a few moments. But for 49 days between the second night of Passover until 7 weeks later at Shavuot, we have a counting practice. And so it's a very tiny ritual, but we'll dive into that counting of the Omer in a few moments. The other thing that happens at the end of Passover is called Yizkor. So at the 3 pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, we end our festival celebration with a memorial service, with a way to think about that in years past, people who had been part of our Passover Seders, our grandparents, our parents, our loved ones, are no longer with us. And so we take an hour at the end of Passover to remember those beloveds from years past. And we just sit in kind of an extended meditation and prayer space, remembering what it was like to have them in our lives and how we miss them terribly now that they're gone. What I now want to talk about is going back to this idea of the 49 days of Omer, and then that leads to this second holiday of Shavuot. And what I want to do is kind of hold up a metaphor of 2 bookends. That the first bookend is the Passover experience of leaving Egypt. And that's kind of the first step in this journey. And then 49 days later, at the end of this is the second bookend, and that's arriving at Mount Sinai. So if we just think of the Exodus story, that in the opening chapters we're enslaved and then we are set free at the Sea of Reeds. And then about 49 days later, Moses and the Israelites arrive at Mount Sinai and receive the 10 Commandments. That's kind of the mythical space that we're inhabiting for these two holidays, for both Passover and Shavuot. So one of the beautiful ideas I like to hold as the day after Passover is this idea of what do I need to do 49 days from now to get ready to receive Torah? How can I leave my sense of oppression behind me? What baggage do I need to leave behind so that I can be ready to receive the 10 Commandments brand new in my life this year? So that becomes the marker of Shavuot 7 weeks later. And I'll dive into some Shavuot practices in a few minutes. But what we can then do is in this 49-day journey from Passover to Shavuot, we can use this as a kind of a mindfulness preparation. So for 49 days, there is a very simple practice that in the evening, you number each day. And you say that today is the first day of the counting of the Omer. The Omer is a sheaf of barley, and the 49th day Shavuot is also the barley festival. In agrarian times, we used to be barley and wheat farmers. And so it is kind of a commemoration of those agrarian times. But it's also a way to think about what do you need to do in the 7 weeks between Passover and Shavuot to get ready for that next experience? How do you imagine what kinds of obligations as a Jew you want to put upon yourself in the year to come? Right? If standing at Sinai is a way to receive the 10 Commandments and take those teachings seriously, it also becomes a really powerful time for conversion students to have their conversion finalized where they can be welcomed in. And we will be doing just that. That Friday night service and dinner we'll have on June 3rd will be the night before Shavuot. And we will be welcoming in a couple of the Judaism 101 students from last year's class as they are fully welcomed into the Jewish community this year. And so there is this fascinating connection with Shavuot and conversion, because the study text for Shavuot is the book of Ruth. Ruth is considered in the Hebrew Bible the first woman who goes through a conversion process. And so many conversion students have this deep affinity and connection to the story of Ruth. Also, Shavuot is considered a night of learning. And so one of the customs around Shavuot is to spend the entire evening learning about Revelation and how we could prepare for that. I will be teaching a session at B'nai Jeshurun where we'll have a community night of learning. It's going to start, I think, around 7 p.m. on that Saturday night, June 4th. It's going to go all the way. I'll be teaching probably in the opening 5 hours. There's going to be literally dozens and dozens of rabbis and Jewish educators coming to teach the entire community in person again this year for the first time in 2 years. I will be teaching this year on the book of Ruth. So if you want to dive deep into Ruth and join me, you're welcome to join me at B'nai Jeshurun on that Saturday night as we'll dive deep into the book of Ruth. Okay. Coming back to a couple of our parts of this. During the 49 days of counting the Omer, there are a couple other moments during that are important on the Jewish calendar. So I just want to kind of quickly talk about each one of those. We will be diving deeper into these 3 holidays or 3 commemorative days in our section about Israel and the Holocaust, because they're all 3 connected to that. But just to mention them here, that the week after Passover ends is Yom HaShoah, which is Holocaust Remembrance Day. And then about a week later is Yom HaZikaron, which is Israel's Memorial Day. That's kind of like Memorial Day here in the United States for our soldiers. Israel commemorates her Memorial Day with a really interesting, different perspective, because after a day of memorial, the very next day is Israel's Independence Day. They don't separate it out by 6 weeks like we do here in the States. They do Memorial Day and Independence Day side by side. Really interesting ritual space to think about. So those 3 days, Holocaust Memorial Day, Israel's Memorial Day, and then Israel's Independence Day are going to be things that we will touch on first next week when we study anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. And then the following week when we dive into the state of Israel and celebrating Israel's history a bit. There is one other day that is important during the 49 days of the Omer, and that's day 33. So day 33 is a teeny tiny holiday called Lag BaOmer, or the 33rd day of the Omer. The Lamed in that term is the number 30. The Gimel is a 3. So Lamed plus Gimel is Lag, and that's how you get the 33rd day of the Omer. The 33rd day of the Omer is a kind of a picnic day where you go out in the May sunshine and you have a picnic and you celebrate the end of a pandemic. Oh, that's kind of meaningful. Maybe we should do that. It seems like there was a plague that was attacking the Jews about 100 years after Jesus. And whether the plague was a plague of Roman soldiers or a plague of disease, it's not clear. But there seems to have been a great deal of death and destruction among the Jews of about 165 in the common area. So Lag BaOmer is the cessation of this plague, this outburst. And you have big bonfires and big parties in celebration of the 33rd day of the Omer. And so it's more like a spring barbecue kind of an event. Very low key, very fun. I now want to take a few minutes and talk about Shavuot practices, because I mentioned a few things. I want to just kind of dive a little bit deeper into a few of these others. I want to think about Shavuot from a couple historical experiences. So from the biblical lens, as I mentioned, this was the barley harvest. And so this was, if we think about Israelite connection to the holidays from a biblical perspective, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot were all harvest festivals. First, the spring harvest has 2 festivals, then the fall harvest has a 3rd. So just being able to see that the Jewish relationship to these festivals is also agrarian and food-based, and thinking about how we are going to be nourishing ourselves, that we eat wheat at in the form of matzah at Passover. The food that we eat at Shavuot is dairy, because the other thing that's coming in, if you're on a farm in June, is that your cows and your sheep are carrying a lot of milk. They're nursing a lot of their babies. And so there is a celebration of dairy feasts at Shavuot. So there's a lot of ice cream, there's a lot of cheese, there's a lot of dairy takes on foods. As the food that we eat at Shavuot, it becomes its own kind of feasting. The rabbis, as they do with Passover, also revive and reframe Shavuot in a completely different manner, because they're leaving Jerusalem after the destruction of the first temple. And so it's there that the rabbis then parallel Shavuot with the 10 Commandments and this rededication of Torah. And so we can see for the last 2,000 years, Jews have been celebrating both the spring harvest as well as Jewish learning. That Shavuot becomes this really wonderful celebration of Jewish learning. So it's not only our conversion students that we celebrate at Shavuot. In many communities, confirmation, which is often done for, let's say, 10th and 11th graders, is celebrated at Shavuot as well. It's a time to celebrate graduation from high school and middle school and lower school. It's a time to celebrate the end of religious school, if you're a kid in my religious school here. And so it really becomes like this interesting moment at the end of our calendar year, or our school year, where we take a breath and notice the role of Jewish learning and Jewish education in our communities. And we celebrate the Jewish learning that has been going on for the year past. And we just kind of recommit ourselves to the importance and the centrality of Jewish learning in our communities. A few other things about Shavuot as we're moving through this. I want to say one more thing about contemporary takes on Shavuot. So two more pieces of this. One is the theme of Shavuot, as I mentioned, is the Ten Commandments, and that the Ten Commandments is a time of celebrating the covenant, the role of the covenant in our life. And so in Hebrew, this is the term brit. And so we often spend our time at Shavuot thinking about the role of the covenant in our lives and how we are either dedicating ourselves either as conversion students or rededicating ourselves to the covenant anew. And so there's a lot of themes and connections to what we're making of these obligations and responsibilities we have. And I can imagine, by Shavuot in 7 weeks, by the beginning of June, we could begin to see Ukrainian refugees starting to come into Northeast Ohio. We could begin to see volunteer opportunities where we could be asked to welcome in folks or supply folks who need stuff. And so I am expecting that during those 7 weeks between Passover and Shavuot, we might see a really interesting series of requests on our communities about welcoming in new people in our communities and figuring out what their needs are. Now, it's not just the Ukrainians who are here, who are probably going to be coming here soon. We've also had for the last several months Afghani refugees slowly coming into our community. And so at Rosh Hashanah and again at Hanukkah, we did some small contributions for those Afghanistan refugees who are here. And so I could even see part of this being an expansive approach to welcoming in not only Ukrainian folks, but also the Afghanistan refugees that are slowly coming into our community as well. So all that is going to be developing over the next couple of months. The last thing I want to say about Shavuot has to do with the book of Ruth, which I mentioned. And I want to connect Ruth not only to conversion as the first convert, but to two other roles that Ruth can celebrate for us in this idea. One is the role of women in our communities, that when Ruth speaks with her mother-in-law, Naomi, it is one of the very few times in the Hebrew Bible where two women talk to each other. So take that in for a minute. This is a book by men for men. So rare is a woman speaking to another woman that we know, for those of us that have learned a little bit of Hebrew, when we are speaking to women plural, women in the plural have their own Hebrew suffix. And we actually use the book of Ruth to kind of learn how to speak about women in the plural. We use the book of Ruth to understand what kind of grammatical forms a woman uses when she speaks to another woman. And so I just want to highlight that Ruth is also a time to celebrate the woman's voice in our community. And the third piece of this, beyond conversion and the voice of a woman, is the queering of the text, that like Song of Songs, we can queer the text of Ruth and think about the love of Ruth and the love of Naomi as not just the love of a mother-in-law and the love of a daughter-in-law, but it can also be perhaps a version of queer love or lesbian love of two women. And so we can see from a queering of this text that it can be a celebration of LGBTQ roles in our community as well. So I just want to kind of lay this all out there that there's at Shavuot, there's a lot to kind of celebrate and be part of as we think about this. The other thing to think about from the calendar is that, just calling up my calendar to make sure that this is correct on the date, but that Saturday, June 4th will be Pride in Cleveland. So that Friday night, June 3rd, will be Pride Shabbat. So it will not only be our Judaism 101 class, but when we join together with the TBS community, we will have a Pride service that Friday night where we'll celebrate our LGBTQ members and their role in our community. So a lot going on around Shavuot and the 7 weeks between Passover and Shavuot. Okay, a lot of content, a lot of stuff, and I want to now take a break and kind of open it up to questions because we started with Passover. We talked about other Passover parts of this. We also talked a little bit about counting of the Omer, and we talked about Shavuot. So I want to just kind of take a step back and open it up to your questions, either about Passover or about the counting of the Omer or about Shavuot. And then after we field some of these questions, I want to take about 10 minutes and chat about kosher for Passover pieces before we finish this off. So let's open up to a Q&A about spring holidays. And who's got some questions or comments about the Jewish spring holidays? Cheryl, why don't you start us off? Cheryl, you.
Okay, yeah, I had to unmute myself, sorry. This is kind of maybe a picky question. It's about the period between Passover and Shavuot. A dear friend of mine passed away about 20 years ago, right after Passover, and the rabbi who was conducting her funeral wouldn't allow a eulogy to be done, said that was forbidden during that period. It was kind of brouhaha, and my friend's daughter actually did one, even though, but he stood by and glared at her. So I didn't understand that. I still don't. I mean, is that part of the restrictions? I know it's supposed to be a period of mourning, but it felt very cruel.
Let me speak to that because it's kind of a traditional or Orthodox practice that for those 49 days between Passover and Shavuot is also considered days of mourning. That it's days where we're in mourning for the loss of the Second Temple in the year 70 of the Common Era. And so because of that, there are a variety of mourning practices that we use to celebrate Lag BaOmer, which means the 33rd day of the Omer, is the time where you can get a haircut. So if you're in mourning for the temple and you're developing some grieving practices, two things that Jews might, traditionally Orthodox Jews might do during these 49 days is grow a beard and not cut their hair. And so you'll often see people go get their hair cut on the 33rd day or on Lag BaOmer as kind of a cessation to those mourning or grieving practices. There are others besides not delivering a eulogy. There's also a prohibition in Orthodox Judaism from getting married during those 33 days. And so Jewish weddings are often not done in Orthodox communities during the 33 days. And often music concerts are kind of avoided. And so, Yom HaAtzmaut, which is going to be during the middle of that, for Orthodox Jews is going to be a time where they're going to probably skip the rock concert at the end of the party. They'll go home. They'll have some dinner. They'll celebrate Israel's independence, but they may not stay for the live music part. And so there are a variety of grieving pieces that the traditional Jewish community connects to. So thank you, Cheryl. That's another part of these Omer practices. I want to say by extension, liberal Jews are not so deeply saddened about the destruction of the temple, primarily because the state of Israel has kind of created a rebirth around Zionism and Zionist identity, and we no longer feel like the tragedy of the 1900 years between the destruction of the temple and the birth of the state of Israel is so longer urgent. There's a sense of renewal and rebirth in Israel. And so we'll kind of dive a little bit into that next week or in 2 weeks when we get to the Israel piece. But yeah, that becomes an interesting part of this as well. Other questions or comments about the spring holidays for Jews? Alex, go ahead.
I don't know how really it plays into it, but I know at Mount Sinai, where did the golden calf come from? That seems like a spring kind of rebirth thing.
Yeah, it is. So we know if we keep reading the book of Exodus that in the beginning of Exodus is slavery and then there's freedom. And then halfway through Exodus is the 10 Commandments story, chapter 20. Then in chapter 32 is this golden calf story. And so we don't quite know how it situates itself between the 10 Commandments and this escapade, but it is part of this storytelling. I won't get into like Israelite practices around golden calves. It seems like the golden calf has its own connection to Egyptian practices around gods in gold images. That was kind of like the normative thing for Egyptian practices. And so part of that golden calf story is perhaps a hearkening back to being back in Egypt and saying, hey, maybe we can bring in one of these Egyptian gods to kind of get us through this nightmare. So I want to just kind of offer up one quick thought about the golden calf. We could, easily spend an hour talking about it. But one thought is sometimes we think of the golden calf as an idol, and that's like an interesting perspective. It could be some kind of idol worship. But I would also like to think of the golden calf from a different metaphoric lens as a step stool, that maybe these different images, whether it's Mount Sinai or the pyramids, if we think of God's footstool, we might be thinking of like how anthropologists think of God intersecting with ancient Israel and ancient Egypt. And so we know that the Egyptians built a high place, that pyramid, and the pyramid was like where a footstool where God would rest God's feet. Mount Sinai is a high place where we might imagine God resting God's, metaphorical feet, if God has feet, kind of a thing. And so we could imagine that the portable sanctuary, the Mishkan, could be another kind of place where God might rest God's feet, and that the golden calf might be best understood not as a God itself, but as a footstool, a place for God to rest God's feet. And therefore, what's missing in the golden calf story is Moses, right? Moses is away. He's been spending 40 days up on Mount Sinai, and he hasn't come back yet. He said he'd be back after 40 days, maybe it's day 41, he's not back. They're panicking. So it could be that what is missing for the Israelites is this intermediary between heaven and earth, and maybe this footstool is what's needed. So it's just another possible reading of that story. But it's a great. There's a certain spring relevance to calves and calving during springtime. Other questions about spring celebrations? Len, go ahead.
There we go. I just thought, well, I had the impression most of my life that it was all about the golden calf appearing because of people's impatience. Moses was taking too long, and they went nuts about that. They said, okay, give me all your gold. We're making a new idol. We're going to have a new way to God. And Moses is nowhere. We lost him.
Yeah, and so I think that's like the typical reading of that story. And I don't want to say it's wrong, Len. I just want to offer it up as The issue I've got with that reading of the story, it's not a bad issue, it's just a complication, is that when we get the instructions to build this Mishkan, this portable sanctuary, in the chapter right before, we do get instructions to create the cherubim, which are these golden images of these angelic beings on top of the Mishkan, or on top of the ark that will sit in the Mishkan. And so the question I often think about, Len, is what's the difference between the golden calf and the cherubim? They're both golden images. Maybe we didn't really have a problem with golden images, and maybe, we're kind of like creating this problem about idol worship that is perhaps needs to be complicated a bit. The reason I want to lay this out is in the book of Kings and a few other places in the book of prophets, we do get a couple stories about golden animals that it seems like the northern tribes are celebrating. One is a calf, another is golden snakes. And so it's a really interesting thing that we've got these strained relationships with these golden beasts. And so I think, Len, your reading is a completely valid reading, but I think there's more to this story and more to the issues of what's up for us around these golden images.
So they could have just put wings on the calves and put them next to the cherubim, and everything would have been okay.
Yeah. So it's a mixed bag. It's really tough to figure out without being hypocritical. Like, why is it okay in one story? Why is it a problem in another? And we certainly see that it's a big problem, right? A lot of people die in the golden calf story. It's a tough story. Thank you. Good point. Other questions or comments about spring holiday stuff before we dive into a little bit more about kosher for Passover foods? Okay, so nothing urgent right now. Then I'm going to add in a couple quick comments about Passover foods. And we talked a little bit about kosher last week and kosher meaning appropriate. We talked about how kosher during 51 weeks of the year is completely different than what we mean by kosher for Passover. That kosher for 51 weeks for Jews is separating milk and meat. Kosher for Passover is about separating for chametz, separating out wheat products. And so this is Jean's earlier point about spring cleaning, that we are going to be spending the next couple of weeks cleaning for Passover. And the idea is to clean out all of our breadcrumbs, right, from wherever they could be. We're supposed to remove the various yeast products from our kitchens and from our dining rooms and from our children's bedrooms and from the dog bowl and like all the places that breadcrumbs could be. It gets to be very complicated. But when we kind of explore the nature of chametz, which is the Hebrew term for yeast, we see that what yeast does when it interacts with flour is it creates this puffy bread, right? And so one of the things that we are removing as we are cleaning for spring is not just the breadcrumbs, but it's our own puffiness, our own arrogance. And so the idea, I think, it's a very powerful spiritual practice that for the next 3 weeks, as we're cleaning our homes, we are also letting go of our arrogance, our own self-inflatedness. And we're kind of trying to figure out, so how can we cultivate an approach towards humility when we arrive at the Passover Seder? Can we really look at our lives and be very clear on where are we navigating our own problems and our own issues? And so I do think part of this spring cleaning that we will be incessantly doing, I already began this week. My son and I on Monday, we bought 2 giant push brooms and we cleaned out the garage and we cleaned out the sunroom, and we're getting, because that's where we put our Passover foods. So, we're getting ready. It's serious business for those of us that take it seriously. It's also very fun. And it's also crazy making, right? We could drive ourselves insane trying to make sure every surface is clean, and the cleaning would never end. And so there has to be like some permission to say you can do what you can do between now and the first night of Seder, and then when you're done, and that's going to be good enough. And so there is part of this to say you don't have to drive yourselves crazy in doing the cleaning. But Jean asked a question earlier about timing of when this is supposed to be cleaned up. So I'll tell you what we do in our house. We will clean all of our Passover, all of our chametz, all of our yeast products out of our home the night before Passover. So the night before Passover is called bedikat chametz, which means the checking for chametz. And in every Haggadah, including the one we'll use here at Temple Beth Shalom, there's a little ritual where you take a feather and you take a candle and you go and you do like a little scavenger hunt in your home. So if you've got little kids, this is a great thing to do. You take out like a stale piece of bread and you break it up into like 10 pieces and you wrap them up in napkins so the crumbs don't get everywhere. And you use the candle and you go in the dark. It's got to be done. You should do it in the dark. You look for the last 10 pieces of bread in your house. You ritually gather them up and you put them in a paper bag. And then the next morning, you have the next part of your ritual, which is called biur chametz. You burn the chametz. You have a little bonfire out on the barbecue or out in your backyard. You get a little baking dish if you need to, and you set up a little bonfire and you burn these last 10 bits of bread. And you are then nullifying all the cookie crumbs that you didn't get in all the corners of the kitchen that you simply didn't have a chance to look at. You're nullifying it all, and you're also selling your chametz. If you have like boxes of pasta that you want to sell to a non-Jew, you can sell your chametz and let it go for 8 days, and you don't eat it for those 8 days, and then you can buy it back from someone ritually at the end of the 8 days. But all this is a way for you to ritualize this process of saying, hey, I'm letting go of this. I'm not going to have cereal or bread or pasta or any other of these foods for 8 days. And during this, I'm hoping to transform my diet. I'm hoping to remove this sense of arrogance from my diet. And so it becomes a really fascinating part of this spring cleaning, where we can, as we're, doing these deep cleaning experiences, can we find time to imagine us letting go of our own pride, our own overinflated sense of self, so that when we arrive at the Passover Seder, we really feel like it's a moment of liberation. And so what we can begin to say is, that sounds a little bit like Lent. Oh, isn't that going on at the same time? I wonder where they're getting this. Yeah, so like the month of Lent, the month of cleaning for Passover, right? There's some similarities here. They're parallel, they're twinned, right? They're learning off of each other. And so part of this is what traditional Christians are doing as well, right? That's their Lenten practices are also hopefully practices of humility as they're preparing for their Easter ritual. Okay, I saw a couple notes in the chat. Ezra, do you want to walk us through some of those comments?
Yeah, there's a question from Len asking, what about the donation to a rabbi for a charity as your agent to certify the house has no wheat?
Yeah, so that's called buying your chametz. And so in some communities, specifically in conservative and Orthodox communities, there's a purchase. So you transact business at a very specific time when you're supposed to burn your chametz, that day, that morning of Seder night. You're supposed to transact this bill of goods. And so the rabbi comes in and ritually takes over your chametz, sells it to a local non-Jew who can own all of our kitchens for the next 8 days and go in and eat up our stuff that hasn't been perhaps eaten up, but they can have access to our kitchens metaphorically if they wanted. And so for 8 days, we sell the leftover chametz to non-Jews. Temple Beth Shalom hasn't been so interested in this practice, and so I haven't thought to do this. It happens at a specific ritual moment, which is also that morning before Passover, which is called the fast of the firstborn. So for those of us who are firstborn, I'm a firstborn, I ritually will attend a study session the morning before Passover. And that study session will stand in place for a day-long fast before the Passover Seder. And so that fast of the firstborn is held the morning before Seder. And so when you complete that study session and you've had your nice breakfast, you then kind of eat your last chametz before Passover. So it's usually a bagel breakfast or something like that. And then you transact this business after that study session of the exchange of your chametz in your home to an agent. And then you go out and you burn your chametz and you kind of have a little bonfire if you want to. And I've actually been to little community bonfires that morning before Seder. It's kind of fun. You have like little marshmallow roast. It's kind of a silly thing to do, but very fun. But all this is to say that preparing for Seder is a big deal. There's a lot of rituals here, a lot of ways to make this meaningful, and a lot of ways to find this process of not only celebrating Passover, but getting ready for the celebration to be spiritually meaningful and ways to connect. So yeah, thank you, Len. That was a great one. I'm going to check in and see if there's any other comments or questions before we put out the homework for next week. So just seeing if anyone's got any other final Passover related or spring related questions. Len, go ahead.
I come from a kosher household as a kid, and we had guest dinnerware and cutlery for company. We had it for the household, both dairy and milk. So that's 4 sets of dishes. And for Passover, we had kosher for Passover for guests that was dairy and meat. And for daytime, we had the glassware, glass dishes. So it was kosher for milk or milk or meat. So altogether, our household had 7 sets of everything. And I thought we had to be all cabinets in the house, but nothing else. No closets, no dressers, just cabinets for dishes. And it drove me nuts. The other thing is, what is kosher and what's not kosher? Because I always thought of it as leavened stuff, meaning yeast. And you mentioned that pasta is not kosher. But when I was a little kid, I got so disillusioned with it all because I was real small when I learned that chunkies were kosher for Passover. And I started thinking, what's not kosher for Passover?
So basically, that's a great question about processed foods, because what happens around kashrut or kosher laws for Passover, it's no longer only about milk and meat. Once you put the term kosher for Passover on the box, it has a very different connotation. And the connotation here, kosher for Passover, means it's processed in a facility where there's no contact or even accidental contact with anything that could be not kosher for Passover. So let's just do a very simple one. Ice cream. Right? Ice cream is typically made with milk and sugar and cream, and you kind of put in some chocolate chips, whatever you're flavoring your ice cream. But what about if those are made in a non-kosher for Passover facility? And you're making kosher for Passover ice cream. You've got to run through all these other processes to make sure that the ice cream and the ingredients going into the ice cream are processed in a kosher for Passover facility. So what we do to make this simpler is, and this is a conservative Jewish practice, is one buys all of their dairy ingredients by the day before Passover. So When I go to the grocery store the day before Passover to buy the milk and the cheese, and we're a vegetarian home, so we eat a lot of dairy during Passover because besides beans, that's all we've got. We have to get some sources of protein. We're not eating a lot of meat in our home at all. We buy all of our kosher, our milk, and we store that up for the entire 9 days or the eight days plus one, because milk the day before Passover Seder is considered kosher. All milk is considered kosher. Milk that is made 4 days later, we don't know if it was processed in a facility that was kosher or kosher for Passover. So we simply buy all of our milk in advance. We buy all of our dairy goods in advance. And that's a way to simplify the process. The other thing we have is for vegans and vegetarians, there is this permission that I talked about last week around eating kitniot, or legumes and beans and rice as well. That for Ashkenazi Jews, they don't give themselves this permission. For Sephardi Jews, they do. And so the Israeli rabbinate ruled about 25 years ago that vegetarians and vegans need to have protein during Passover. And so vegetarians and vegans can be consider themselves Sephardi for the holiday of Passover, and they can enjoy the beans and the legumes in their diet and still be considered kosher for Passover. The other thing you should know, and I did check this out for you to make sure this is real, there is a new kosher grocery store in Cleveland Heights. It's called The Grove. And alongside Unger's, which has been here for decades, The Grove is a kosher grocery store that serves lots of Israeli foods. And so I went into The Grove with Gabriel on Monday, and I said, are you going to have a section of your Passover foods that will be for vegetarians and vegans for these beans and called kitniot? And they said, yeah, in the corner was a little sign that that was going to be where they're going to put all their kitniot. So what that means to the Jews of Cleveland is like really big news. Ezra and I were talking about this a little bit before the session, that until this moment, the Jews in Cleveland who were vegetarian or vegan could not have any kitniot. If you went to Unger's, they never served any, they didn't sell you any kitniot for Passover. This is the first time that the Jews in Cleveland, and by extension, the neighborhoods around Cleveland, are going to have access to this permission for vegetarians and vegans to purchase kitniot or beans and rice for Passover. So it might seem trivial to the liberal Jews who don't worry about this, but to the folks who do keep some of these kosher laws, this is a big deal. This is a huge step of permission where they can have a richer, more complex diet during Passover. So I think that's kind of a nice harbinger, as it were, that Jewish Cleveland is getting a little bit more contemporary and a little more diverse. It's not only for Ashkenazi folks, but it's for, by extension, Sephardi, as well as vegans and vegetarians, which is a very, very nice sign. Okay, so Len, you wanted to say something about matzah. Go ahead.
Yes, very quickly. During the year, they sell matzah, but it's not kosher for Passover. They prepare it specially for Passover, and a pound box is really expensive. The only economical way to do it is to buy a 5-pound box package, which is what I do. But have you got any idea? I'm now in a one-person household, and you have any idea how much matzah bread you have to eat after Passover to use it up?
Yeah.
It's incredible because on for months. That's it.
So, Len, let me make a recommendation to stop buying, just like I would say, don't buy white bread anymore. You should buy wheat bread. Get the better matzah out there. The white matzah is terrible. There's better matzah out there. There's whole wheat matzah. There's egg matzah. There's, organic. There's better matzahs out there. Yes, it's going to cost more. You're going to spend more, but it will taste better.
Well, matzah bread becomes egg matzah.
Of course it does, yeah. So if you make your matzah bread with egg matzah, it's even eggier. So there's all kinds of ways to do it.
Okay, I'll try it.
Great. Okay, thank you for joining. Let me give you a little bit about the homework. The homework is In Essential Judaism, there's about 5 pages about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. Let me call up those page numbers so that you know them. Pages 492 to 496 are about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. Also, the big reading for the next week or two is the book Night. Night is Elie Wiesel's autobiography about his experience in the concentration camps. And so just, that's the reading for this week. It's more than just 20 or 30 minutes. I know that you can take 2 weeks if you need to read Night. But we're going to be talking next week about anti-Semitism and about the Holocaust. And we'll also do a little bit on the resurgence of anti-Semitism in the last 10 years here. Most of it, though, will be a historical understanding, because I think the historical piece will be helpful. A quick note about Night: it's a quick read. So if you just if you put it on your nightstand, it's going to be something you can get through pretty quickly. He's a good writer. He's really a good writer. If you've never read Elie Wiesel, it's not a happy book. It's a very hard book. You'll be crying. You'll be crying a lot. That's what the Holocaust is. We should be crying. Okay. A couple other things about what's going on here at Temple Beth Shalom this week. All this stuff will be laid out in tomorrow's email, but this Friday night we'll have a Shabbat service here. One of our spring bat mitzvah students will be leading the service this Friday night. Her name is Sophie Lewis. So you're welcome to join us for that Friday night service at 7:30. The big thing I would like to encourage you to, if you don't want to be here every day this weekend, is the Saturday morning special section on the Passover Haggadah. We'll be using our Haggadah, which is called the Open Door Haggadah, as kind of like a base line to go through. And that's going to be Saturday morning, 9:30 to 11. And in the email that I'll send, I'll put Zoom links for both of these. So if you wanted to attend either, the Zoom links will be available. And you're also welcome to come in person. The other thing you should know about Torah study here, because we're now permitting ourselves to eat, we're going to have some bagel brunches here as well. So that will be a bagel brunch for folks who want to join. There'll be fresh bagels and cream cheese and hot coffee if you want to be in person for that. That group has been growing, that Saturday morning Torah study group. And so I think it's going to continue to grow. I'm hoping that it will continue to be like a new corner of our community. And so as you want to be part of that, you should feel welcome to connect to that corner of our community. Okay, we will buy a bunch. All right, so have a great week, and I will see everybody next weekend. Take care.